everyone. My name is Shawn, and welcome to Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. Hi, everyone. Shawn here with episode 13 of Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. This is going to be part 2 of our series on Mythic Parenting 101, the relationship between Odin and Thor and the making of a god. I know that this was supposed to be a 2-parter, but once again, I'm pushing to a third because in preparation for this episode, I realized that there was a good amount I wanted to discuss in our 2.5 stories that we are covering today. And I guess Thor himself does deserve 3 episodes, with part 3, of course, focusing on Chris Hemsworth's abs and hair. In part 1, we watched Thor get knocked around a bit, figuratively, not in ways that had him losing fights, mind you. But despite even while he navigated some wins by smashing the skulls of giants, we saw him suffer some losses and humiliations in situations where his raw power and strength were not enough. And for a god defined almost entirely by his power, these moments certainly matter because they figuratively strip Thor down to what he is when that power is useless, or at the very least, not enough in a situation. We started off the last episode with the Poetic Edda poem Harbard's Laud, where Thor's father Odin, disguised as a ferryman, at least at first, stood on the other side of a fjord that Thor was trying to cross. However, instead of offering his son passage on his little boat, Odin decides to insult Thor to his face while minimizing his accomplishments, which essentially boil down to Thor killing giants and protecting the gods, sort of implying how one-dimensional Thor is in his approach to life. Despite his strength, he gets insulted and is forced to prolong his journey going the long way around the fjord to get home. We then looked at several stories that reinforce Thor's imperfections and insecurities. In the tale of Hrungnir, Thor successfully kills the giant Hrungnir, but the victory leaves him pinned helplessly between the dead giant's leg, only to be saved by his 3-year-old son Magni. It's a win, but at the end he finds himself in a vulnerable state requiring a toddler to set him free, reinforcing his own limits. In the story of Garrod, Thor finds himself on a journey without his hammer, and is forced to rely on assistance from his half-brother Vidar's mother Grid, who, funny enough, is a giantess, who gives him other tools and shelter that allow him to continue and navigate this journey to eventually kill Garrod without his hammer. But once again, realizing he cannot do this by himself, he relies on the assistance of others to win in this situation. The powerful god Thor requiring the help of a giantess. We then discuss the poem Thrymsvida, where Thor finds himself without his hammer Mjolnir again. And to get it back from the giant Thrym, he needs to pretend to be the Vanir goddess Freya, put on a wedding dress, and become a bride-to-be of the giant Thrym, who at that point was the temporary wielder of Mjolnir. So in Thor's mind, now worrying about what the internet edgelords had to say about him wearing a dress, something Thor stated he would be insecure about when he thinks about his reputation and how he is viewed, the mighty Thor is, quote, reduced to being in drag, despite his outfit having nothing to do with his strength. And he proves this by killing the giant while wearing that wedding dress. All these stories taken together show us a Thor who is incredibly effective as a weapon, but also more often than not, simply a hammer where every problem is a nail. But as we see, he must operate in a world where not everything is a nail. Everyone has limits, and this seems to be something his father knows about better than he does. We have had many episodes on Odin's legacy. So in this episode, let's dive deeper into Thor, with episode 3, and hopefully this time I mean it, wrapping up the stories about Thor and discussing his own legacy. And as we will see, many of Thor's limits will continue as he deals with the forces of nature that he cannot control, if not bodies of water, but also perhaps, as mentioned, his mortality, and the idea of fighting one's age and decline despite the 0% of success that we have seen so far in our world. And we're also going to see in this episode that even Thor's power and strengths as a hammer looking for a nail also have limits. Not unlike Thor not being able to lift the giant's leg off his neck, but more so prominent in the first story that we talk about today. So now today, we are going to get started with the story of Utgarða-Loki, found in Gylfaginning from the Prose Edda. And actually, really quick, I did want to say something that some people online may say that Harbard from Harbard's Laud was actually Loki in disguise and not Odin in disguise, which would have been in character for him, as we do see him in situations where he does throw insults upon others. And you have also seen that he can take on the shapes of others as well. But for right now, this podcast is not going to be the, you know what? Maybe this is Loki in disguise podcast. Anyway, on to parts 44 through 47 of Gylfaginning from Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda. Part 44 starts with High, just as High, and Third, the three beings in all aspects of Odin, telling a man named Gangleri, who's actually a King Gylfi of Sweden, about the Norse myths. And the three express sadness in having to tell this story of Thor's limits and him. They begin the tale by discussing an adventure that he is on with Loki. Thor and Loki stay the night at a farmer's house. Thor then slaughters his goats for food, knowing that these goats do regenerate the following day. What a life for his goats. They pull Thor on his chariot all day, only to be slaughtered and eaten, then regenerate to do it again the following day. As the farmer was giving them shelter, the farmer, his wife, their son Thialfi, and daughter Röskva were offered some of the goats to eat. Thor collects the bones of the goats after the feast and puts them together so they can regenerate for the next morning. However, Thialfi, the son of the farmer, not completely nourished, takes a bone, breaks it in half, and eats the bone marrow. The next morning, after the goats regenerate, Thor sees that one of his goats has a limp, as his leg was broken, the leg that Thialfi took the bone marrow from. More lovely news for the goat, who now has to navigate a limp on top of his living and never-ending hell of an existence. Thor knew that it was the boy and immediately grows angry. The farmer and his wife begin to cry, realizing that their son crippled one of the goats belonging to the mighty god Thor. And they know that Thor has a reputation for being quite impulsive and violent to those who slight him. However, Thor here uncharacteristically sees the fear of this family that sheltered him and decides to sort of forgive them. And instead of killing the boy and potentially the entire household, he accepts their apologies but takes Thialfi and Röskva as servants of his own. So obviously not an ideal situation for the kids to be taken. However, the farmer and his wife were probably pleased that their kids were at least alive, though being a quote servant could mean many things. However, with Thialfi, it seems that he eventually earns favor from Thor and is not necessarily a slave to be punished by him. In fact, in the story with Thor's duel with Hrungnir, as I mentioned, Thialfi comes off as sort of a squire for Thor. Now, as far as the farmer's daughter, Röskva, especially with what Thor admitted to being okay with in Harbardslaud, I would be quite worried about the life that she has ahead of her as well. But anyway, I find this interesting because my first thought here was of Frodo and Sam not killing Gollum upon capturing him, knowing full well that he may try to slit their throats at nighttime in the Lord of the Rings series. The story with Thor and Thialfi does not have a comparable ending to that series, but you saw with Frodo and Sam that letting Gollum live and showing restraint, as in not killing him when it seemed logical to do so, ended up with those actions resulting in the ring being destroyed. Now, if they had killed Gollum, they probably never would have made it to Mordor in the first place and would have probably been captured by orcs, dooming Middle-earth. So again, a loose parallel, but interesting to think about Thor in this case of not giving in to his bloodthirsty impulse and getting a loyal squire as a result of it that somewhat benefits him in the future, showing potentially some growth in a humanized restraint on his part. Now, going into chapter 45, their journey continues with Thor, Loki, Thialfi, and Röskva as well. But unfortunately, they do go without the goats. They travel across a wide ocean. Maybe Thor 2, Water 1 at this point? Never mind, it doesn't count since they most likely had a boat here, so it's still 1-1. They come to land, and short on supplies, they need a place to stay for the night. They stumble upon a large hall that was empty, but stayed there for the night. During the night, they were awoken due to an earthquake, putting them on edge. In the morning, however, Thor leaves the hall and finds a man who is asleep and snoring heavily. The snoring sounded like what the earthquake from the previous night sounded like, and showing us any restraint on his part was maybe short-lived, Thor decides to kill this man while he slept. However, as he approached the man wakes up, and Thor uncharacteristically became very afraid. The man stated that his name was Skrymir. He knew who Thor was right away and asked where his glove was. Skrymir then finds his glove and picks it up, and it was actually the hall that the group slept in the night before. Skrymir happens to be a large giant. Skrymir then offers to go on the journey with the Thor, and Thor agrees. However, Skrymir, for the rest of part 45, finds ways to embarrass Thor. At first, they combined their food and belongings into one bag, and Skrymir carried it throughout the day with ease. When they stopped for the night, he told Thor that he wanted to sleep, but that Thor was welcome to make his food while he did, requiring Thor to open this sack to get the food. Thor, however, was unable to untie the bag. He becomes very angry at not being able to do so, and again decides to try and kill Skrymir while he sleeps. And he strikes him in the head with Mjolnir. However, Skrymir, obviously not dead at this point, wakes up and asks Thor if a leaf had fallen on his head, which is humiliating to Thor. That night, when they were supposed to be sleeping, Thor tries again, and Skrymir wakes up asking if an acorn had fallen upon his head. As it approaches morning, Thor eventually tries again, and Skrymir, upon being hit for a third time, wakes up and mistook Thor's swings as birds dropping twigs on him. Skrymir at that point says it's time to wake up and continue their journey. Skrymir warned his companions about the character of the individuals in the hall that they were looking for, including Utgarða-Loki, its leader. However, Skrymir's path led him northward and not to the castle Utgard. So he left the crew, ending part 45. Thor notably wasn't upset that Skrymir parted ways with them, but obviously humiliated that his previous swings and attempt to kill Skrymir with Mjolnir, again, this is what is supposed to be his strength, especially with giants. If Thor was still a one-dimensional being in his approach to life, he's failing at the one thing that he should be the best at, killing and instilling fear in the hearts of giants with Mjolnir. Now on to part 46, where Thor and his companions arrive at the castle Utgard. The gate was shut, so Thor tries to open it but was unable to do so. They were able to, however, shimmy their way through the bars. They enter the main hall and come to the king, Utgarða-Loki, and yes, that is his name. The king states that he knew one of them was Thor, but calls him a, quote, little fellow, and asks him to have some skills competitions against the members of his court. And this wasn't just for Thor, but also for Loki and Thialfi. Loki steps up and states that nobody could eat as much as him. Utgarða-Loki then calls somebody named, quote, Logi to go up against Loki in this eating contest. They had both of them sit at one end of the table that's filled with meat, and the rules were simple, to see who ate more. So the two start the competition eating all the food on their sides of the table to the point where they eventually meet in the middle. When they met at the middle, you see that they both have successfully eaten their food. However, you notice that Loki did not consume the bones, whereas Logi did. So Logi was declared the winner and Loki lost. Before I discuss the next competition, I did want to say that you may see some links online to Loki with fire, as in he may have at some point in this world been viewed of as some type of god of fire. And to be honest, I'm not in a place to say whether this is true or not, but looking forward to researching more, of course. However, I did want to bring this up because Logi, which has a very similar name to Loki, obviously, was mentioned in the Hversu Norwegian Bygdist, which means how Norway was settled. Now, we have discussed Norway a lot on this podcast with the first historical king, Harald Fairhair, but also the first legendary king and son of Odin, Shaman. So we will dissect this text further in a later episode as well. But for now, allow me to read the very first words of this text. It says, Now shall be told the proofs how Norway was first inhabited, or how kingly Stocks began, there or in other lands, or why they are called the Skeldungs, Budlings, Ragnings, Adlings, Volsungs, or Niflungs, from which the royal races have come. There was a man called Fionat. He had 3 sons. One was Slayer, another Logi, the third Carry. He ruled over the winds, but Logi over fire. So keep this in mind for later with the connection between Logi and fire. Obviously, any connection to fire here is not with Loki, but with Logi. This doesn't matter too much for this episode, but you have to admit that the names are similar, and in the myths, Loki's actions do figuratively spread and cause chaos among the gods, the way that we may see fire literally do in the world. The next competition puts Thialfi up against somebody named Hugi in a race. They race 3 times, and each time Hugi wins, getting faster each time. So Thialfi lost as well, though he does seem to do a pretty good job. Maybe the bone marrow from Thor's goats gave him his extra boost in running or something. However, then it was Thor's turn. Utgarda-Loki asked Thor to name his competition, and Thor stated he wanted to have a drinking competition. Nice. They gave him a feasting horn and stated that a true drinker could empty the horn in one single gulp. For some people, it takes two, but nobody could not do it in three. Thor took the largest drink that he could. However, upon inspection, the horn had only been drained slightly. Utgarda-Loki noted how little Thor was able to actually drink. Thor tries again and takes an even longer drink to where he was almost out of breath. However, even less was drained from the horn. Thor tries again. Once again, barely anything was drunk from the horn. They then challenged Thor's physical strength, encouraging him to lift up a small cat. Thor tried with all of his might, however, only was able to lift up one paw. Utgarda-Loki calls the contest and then sets up a wrestling competition for Thor to wrestle an old woman named Ellie. The mighty Thor, no matter how much he grappled the old woman, was not able to knock her off her feet. Thor loses his footing and Utgarda-Loki calls the contest, with our heroes being hit with yet another loss. The companions were given a place on the bench and were able to feast the rest of the night. And though they were treated well, all were embarrassed, especially for Thor. This is where part 46 of Gylfaginning ends. So, taking into account last week's episode, we hear of Thor's wins and losses, with his wins primarily coming from his raw power and strength. However, you see here that Thor begins losing with what is supposed to be the thing that he is good at. Thor drinks and he kills things, and he is super strong. Now, having said that, in part 47, Thor does receive some encouraging news. So the next morning, after partying in the castle Utgard, Thor and his party prepare to leave. They eat their breakfast and sets it apart, but Utgarda-Loki goes with them a bit as they leave. He asks Thor how he was doing, and Thor admits embarrassment due to his visit. Utgarda-Loki then comes clean with something, and he states that if he truly knew how powerful Thor was, he never would have considered letting him near the castle, for everything about their interaction was a trick. And Utgarda-Loki also reveals himself to be Skrymir from earlier as well. And he stated that his sack at the beginning that Thor could not untie was actually fastened with iron wire, and that when he was struck in the head 3 times, Skrymir was able to magically move a mountain in the way of his head. So what Thor struck was the mountain, and Thor did nearly flatten the mountain with his strength. Loki was actually in an eating contest with fire. Again, we have it in writing elsewhere that Loki is linked with fire. Thialfi was racing against Utgarda-Loki's mind, and Thor was drinking from a horn that contained all of the water in the ocean, and he did make a dent in the water levels with his drinking alone. So a stretch on my part to really push the narrative with Thor v. Water, but now it is kind of Thor 1, Water 2, since Thor was not able to drink the entire ocean. And the cat was actually the Midgard serpent that surrounds the world. This would be Jormungandr and Loki's son, funny enough, although this familial relation was not mentioned in this story. And the woman was old age, or the passage of time, and one's mortality, something that nobody can beat. But old age did have issues wrestling Thor, funny enough. So clearly, since Loki was with Thor and they traveled to a castle belonging to a being named Utgarda-Loki, and he was present with Loki and his son Jormungandr, this whole thing was clearly set up by Loki, and everybody there was actually just Loki in disguise. Oh, wait, I said I was not going to do that. Now, I just wanted to throw that in there because it's fun to think about, and I'm not actually taking Loki being everybody in the castle as truth in the scope of this episode, and because that clearly is not what Snorri is trying to imply here. But since Loki's son Jormungandr was technically present, it would have been funny if he saw the quote cat, then if he realized it was his son, and Loki was just like, oh, hey, son, you silly goose. What are you doing here, you venomous little snake? So anyway, what Thor and his companions did was actually quite impressive. Note also that the farmer's son, Thialfi, whose life Thor spared, played a part in instilling this fear on Utgarda-Loki. He was able to compete against somebody else's mind and thoughts. So I am not a physicist, but I do know about the speed of light. And I know that even at the speed of light, it would take years to reach another star other than our own. However, when thinking about racing against somebody's thoughts, let's say that we're on Earth at nighttime and we look at the ground that we're standing on and our perception or our mind is focused there. Now look up at a star. within a second, our mind is focused on the star. So a very loose thought on my end, but this is what I think of when Thialfi is running against somebody's mind and how fast it figuratively could be with our perception focusing on the ground, and then a second later, the star. Thor, now encouraged but still pissed off, tries to kill Utgarda-Loki again. However, he disappears, as does the castle Utgard. Thor and his party return home, but Thor, with maybe his elevated encouragement upon finding out that what he did was actually impressive. I mean, he did some damage to literal forces of nature with the oceans, the world serpent who circles the world, and old age. And then he decides to do something about Jormungandr, who the gods know will take part in Ragnarok. So taking a page out of his father's book and trying to stop their fates, which is maybe another force of nature the gods don't have control of, Thor is trying to go against the will of the Norns to try to stop it. And this brings us both to chapter 48 of Gylfaginning from the Prose Edda, but also the poem Hymnsvida, not Thrymsvida, which we discussed last week, from the Poetic Edda. Now, these are two different versions of what I like to call Thor's fishing trip, with the Poetic Edda version, the fishing part not even being the main part of the story. I'm going to start with that version, where the motivation for Thor going fishing was not even his idea. But then I'll go back to the story arc that we see at the end of Gylfaginning that goes straight from Utgarda-Loki into Thor proactively going fishing for the sole purpose of capturing Jormungandr, the son of Loki who will spawn Ragnarok, but more importantly, the cat who embarrassed Thor. So in Hymnsvida, the gods were thirsty after a hunting trip and wanted to start a bender to quench their thirst. But they did not have a cauldron for the beer. The god Aegir, or it seems based on the text here, who was also a giant, decides to throw a party for the gods, but needs a cauldron to do so. The gods are unsure of where to get the cauldron. However, the god Tyr tells Thor about his father Hymir, who is also a giant, and he states that his father has a cauldron that is 1 mile deep. So Thor and Tyr travel to the quote end of the sky to borrow it from Hymir. They arrive and they meet Tyr's grandmother and his mother. His grandmother has 900 heads, by the way. Tyr's mother and Hymir's concubine told them that Hymir may not appreciate them being there, and he could be upset when he returns home, primarily because as a giant, Hymir would have no love for Thor due to his reputation of smashing the skulls of giants. In fact, Tyr's mother needs to meet Hymir outside when he returns home to tell him the news. And upon finding out that Thor was under his roof, Hymir decides to try and smash his own house to bits with Thor and his son inside. However, in this world, we do see the idea of a guest's right, not unlike we see in the Game of Thrones, minus some of the events like the Red Wedding, but overall in the Norse world, hospitality is a virtue. And you see this message in the Poetic Edda poem Havamal, which is a long poem where Odin gives his own ideas of morals and how to live one's life. So anyway, Hymir reluctantly butchers some of the bulls for the pair to eat for that night, since they are under what is left of his roof. After Thor alone eats 2 whole bulls, Hymir, then upset, states that they will need to go fishing for food the following day if any of them wanted to have supper the following night. Thor agrees. He goes into the woods and cuts off the head of an ox for bait for the fishing trip. Hymir is pissed off about the death of the ox now, but takes no further action against Thor at this point, probably understanding that he would need Thor's help in fishing. The following day they go fishing. However, Thor wants to go too far out into the deep water for Hymir's liking. Hymir still successfully catches 2 whales on one single hook, which is not too shabby at all. However, Thor, again, using the ox's head as bait, snags the world serpent Jormungandr. Thor is able to pull the serpent that supposedly surrounds all of Midgard onto the boat and hits its head with Mjolnir. When he does so, volcanoes around the world erupt at the wail of the sea monster. However, he then sinks back into the water, and that ends the fishing trip, with in this case the fate of Jormungandr, wounded most likely, but not really known. Thor and Hymir travel back to Hymir's house, and Hymir, pissed off at the danger of what just happened, along with the earlier circumstances, does not say anything to him. But eventually, when they arrive on land, does tell Thor to either carry a whale or tie up the boat. Instead, Thor just lifts up the entire boat with the whales in it and carries it all the way to his house, annoying Hymir even more. I mean, it's great that he got the whales, but now his boat is on dry land. Hymir then, not entirely unlike Utgarda-Loki, demands a test of strength from Thor, and that test being to see whether or not Thor could break his cup. Thor throws the cup at Hymir's head and shatters the cup. Hymir acknowledges his aspiring career as a mixologist is over before it began, and that he would never be able to make a drink again. So Thor and Tyr eventually take the huge cauldron, which Hymir allows them to borrow, and after leaving, the pair notice a bunch of giants coming after them to kill them. However, Thor killed them all with Mjolnir. The text also states that they were, quote, fire giants. Funny story here is that when they get back to their own transportation, which would be Thor's goats, this is when Thor notices the lame leg of one of his goats. So not only, as we see in this story here, are there different versions of the events on Thor's fishing trip between the prose and poetic Eddas, this also holds true with the story of Thor's goats. In this case, it sort of implies a fire giant named Egil crippled the goats, and Thor takes his two children as a result of this, perhaps an unnamed Roskva and Thialfi. But it also states that this was the work of, quote, Loki's lies. Now, keep in mind, in this poem, Loki was not even mentioned yet. So I'm not going to bring up any connection here between Loki and fire again in a push on my part to say that everyone involved was secretly being manipulated or was Loki in disguise, because once again, I said I would not do that. Though I think many times in the stories and myths, it is definitely worth thinking of as a possibility. And here the text does say that Loki was involved in crippling Thor's goats. But here you also need to wonder if Snorri pulled some themes from the stories available to him when he authored his Prose Edda, taking some contradictions to try and make a more linear story that does help us to understand what the Scandinavians may have thought about the gods while also making the contradictions apparent. But to sum it up, outside of Thor getting the cauldron so the gods can party, Thor shows off his strengths many times to the pissed off giant Hymir, and even more importantly, Thor goes after Jormungandr, who the gods know will spearhead the events surrounding Ragnarok. Also, quick notes, some loose parallels here that I am completely inserting solely based on the fact that I recently read Exodus from the Bible, and that is that Thor's feats of strength almost comes off as being similar to the plagues of Egypt, at least with Hymir's land, with Hymir being the pharaoh who refuses to let the Israelites go, only to eventually and reluctantly do so. But then, due to his hardened hearts, at the hand of the Abrahamic God, changes his mind, goes after Moses and the Israelites, only for his army to be swallowed up by the Red Sea. So somewhat of Thor being Moses, only instead of leading hundreds and thousands of freed slaves, Thor gets a cauldron so he can drink a shitload of beer, then after being given the cauldron is potentially pursued by other giants, maybe at the encouragement of Hymir. And maybe Loki is playing the Abrahamic God Yahweh here and proactively hardens Hymir's heart, forcing him to change his mind in the first place, and unsuccessfully sends the fire giants to kill Thor and Tyr. And I may have just committed blasphemy in four religions. So now let's go on to the Prose Edda version of events of Thor's fishing trip, which conveniently takes place right after Utgarða-Loki comes clean to Thor about his strengths and his, quote, losses that we discussed earlier. So as the four parts of Gylfaginning discussing the arc of Utgarða-Loki were 44 through 47, this story is going to come in part 48, which is also right before we get into the funeral of Thor's brother Balder, which would be in part 49, which we are going to discuss in part 3, and I promise the final part of the series on Thor. But let's start with a quote about Thor that ends part 47 right after Thor returns home to Thrudvangr from the castle Utgard. It says, "Then turning back, he journeyed until he came once again to Thrudvangr. In truth, it can be said that from then on he was determined to find a way to confront the Midgard serpent." So then it goes into part 48. Now, Gangleri asks, "But didn't Thor take vengeance in return?" Hai then says, "Even those who are not men of learning know that Thor made amends for the journey he just recounted. He was not home for long before he prepared to set out again. Leaving Midgard disguised as a young boy, he arrived one evening at the house of a giant, the one called Hymir." So another similarity of this trip is that Thor goes on the trip with Hymir. One other item of note is that Thor, suffering at first what seemed to be humiliation in his loss at the hands of Utgarða-Loki, is now under the mindset of, you know what, I literally was able to drink a good portion of the ocean, I did somewhat put a dent in old age, and I lifted part of the world serpent. Which all of this kind of reminds me of Captain America's initial, quote, failure of lifting Mjolnir in the second Avengers movie, but slightly moving it at the surprise of Thor. only to successfully wield it in the fourth Avengers movie. I apologize for the spoilers there, but the movie is 7 years old now, and now I feel even older, old age, or this damn cat in the story are inevitable, just like Thanos. But also note here is that maybe Thor is experiencing some growth again. Let's pretend his disguise is him learning from his father Odin, who was in disguise in Harbardsland, or maybe his disguise in drag in Thrimsvida, though humiliating to him as well, allowed him to understand that this secrecy may be beneficial to him, and infiltrating the trust of a giant who may not let him in his home if he knew that it was Thor that he was speaking to. Sorry, another tangent, but in Harbardsland, Odin does recount Thor being in the glove belonging to Skrymir, which again, the text makes very clear took place right before Thor's fishing trip. So most likely Harbardsland would not have happened yet. And any growth on Thor's part that I have and will continue to discuss in this series is contradictory interpretation on my part of the character. So Thor, as a young boy, stays the night and takes shelter at Hymir's. The next morning, Thor stated his intention to go fishing and convinced Hymir to go with him. Like in Himsvida, Hymir does not want to go too far out due to the potential danger of the sea. Upon hearing this, Thor initially wants to kill Hymir with his hammer, but he decides against it. And also, like in the poem, gets the head of an ox to use as bait. They go to sea and continue to argue about how far they want to row out, with Hymir again specifying his fear specifically of Jormungandr, who again is exactly who Thor is looking for. Thor keeps rowing into the deep sea despite a worried and unhappy Hymir. Thor casts his line with the ox's head, and this works. Thor is successfully able to bait the serpent. Jormungandr swallows the ox's head, and the hook digs into his gums. Jormungandr snaps back hard and pulls back with all of his strength. He pulled so hard that Thor's feet went through the bottom of the boat, and he needed to use the bottom of the seafloor to brace himself. So it seems either the serpent who surrounds all of Midgard is actually super small, or Thor grows in stature a tad. He is able to begin successfully pulling the serpent onto the boat, and at this point, I'm also now wondering how big this boat actually was. Thor continues to focus on his catch, while the serpent begins spraying venom. This whole situation scares the living fuck out of Hymir, who at this point is probably thinking, hey, you know what? Maybe this little boy with a lollipop and one of those spinny hat things that I always see in the comic books is not actually a little boy, and there's probably something more to the situation that I cannot put my finger on. Anyway, Hymir grows pale and fears for his life, and at the moment that Thor was about to get the world serpent onto the boat and deal a blow with Mjolnir, Hymir cuts the line, freeing the serpent, but in his mind, freeing himself from shitting his pants further due to the danger that he was in. The serpent begins to sink, and Thor throws Mjolnir at it. And Hai, again, who's telling the story, then says, people say that down on the bottom, he struck the serpent's head off. But I think the opposite is true. The Midgard serpent still lives in the surrounding sea. So Thor, pissed off, punches Hymir's head straight off his body and overboard. Keep in mind that the boat has holes in it now, so Thor needed to swim back to shore and defeat. So I'm glad for Thor, it seems that he actually can swim at least, but now it seems that his whole interactions with water results in another loss. So it's now Thor 1, Water 3. So I'm going to end with that story, primarily just Utgarða-Loki and Thor's two different versions of his fishing trip. But before I close out the episode, I did want to talk about why I think this story, with Thor just so close to killing Jormungandr and potentially altering the outcome of Ragnarok if he succeeded, is pretty interesting to me. The gods know of Loki's children, Fenrir, Hel, and Jormungandr, and their roles in spearheading Ragnarok. In fact, this knowledge is what caused them to chain up Fenrir, the wolf, and banish Jormungandr out to sea. Thor, realizing in the story of Utgarða-Loki that he does have the ability to bend, if not break, the forces of nature, whether it is drinking a large portion of the ocean or somewhat knocking down old age, despite losing the wrestling match in the end. So when you think of old age or one's mortality, you could argue that we are fated at one point to die. And in this world, fate is set by the Norns, and the gods know their fate at Ragnarok. But that does not stop Thor from nearly killing the world serpent. The only thing that stopped him here was a giant who feared for his life. Now, what if Thor simply just used Hymir's boat and went into the deep sea without him? Or let's say when Thor initially wanted to kill Hymir, he went ahead and did so before this interaction with Jormungandr. would Thor have succeeded in his mission? So was Hymir fated to do what he did just the way he did it, or was it free will on his end? A more topical parallel here would be the movie The Matrix, which is one of my favorites. In that movie, Keanu Reeves plays Neo, the one who is fated to save humanity. Neo and his crew are aboard their ship, but they are able to send their consciousness into the Matrix, which is like a virtual world that most humans are a part of, and they think that that is their real life. However, when they're in the Matrix, their real bodies are hooked up to a machine and lifeless. One of their crewmates, a man named Cypher, upon leaving the Matrix to enter the real world first, kills the two crew members who never entered, leaving Cypher as the only one that could get the rest of his shipmates back. But you see that Cypher took these actions because he made a deal with the villains of the movie, the machines. He wanted to no longer be a part of the real post-apocalyptic world that the Earth was currently in. And the deal was that the machines would download him back into the Matrix and wipe his memory of it. So as in, he wanted a good life in the Matrix, even though it wasn't real. The machines agreed to this if he killed Neo, preventing him from saving humanity. And at this moment, you find that the crew members that are in the Matrix are at his mercy, with their real bodies there for him to kill. One by one, he does kill them, only until Neo and a woman named Trinity are left. Cypher decides here to make a show of delaying killing them at this point because he has the hots for Trinity, and she has the hots for Neo, and Cypher knows this. Now, in his delayed monologue, you find out that he did not kill both of the initial crew members, because one of them, a guy named Tank, survived. He then has his cool little ray gun and kills Cypher, brings Neo and Trinity back, and Neo's fated path continues. So just like Hymir, and yes, I did not ever think I'd be doing a podcast where I compare a fictitious giant named Hymir to the biblical pharaoh in Genesis, but also Cypher from the Matrix in the same episode, but here I am. But anyway, just like Hymir, Cypher and him had the ability to change fate, or did they? By either not cutting the fishing line or killing Neo and not waiting a bit to make a show of it to give Tank more time to woundedly pick up a gun and fire and kill him. So just an interesting thought when you think about the idea of fate versus free will. So tying this back into Thor, what makes Thor's fishing trip so important is not just that he fails, it's how he fails. Earlier in these stories, Thor loses because he is tricked, humiliated, or stripped of his tools. Here, he sort of does everything right. He plans, he disguises himself, he targets the true threat of the gods, that being Jormungandr, and he also shows restraint where he previously was impulsive, though maybe his restraint in killing Hymir is what prevented this. He even wounds the creature he is fated to die fighting. And still the moment slips away, not because Thor is weak, but because either the giant did this on his own terms or the Norns forced him to do so. And that tells us something crucial about Thor's growth. And again, this really only works if my timeline of events is true, which, as I mentioned, it does not make sense. But to me, if this order was true, it does seem that he is adapting. He's confronting forces that aren't just giants, but nature, fate, and the inevitability of death. And yes, I pulled that last quote also from The Matrix, where Mr. Smith says that the oncoming train to Mr. Anderson, aka Neo, is the inevitability of death. That obviously pisses Neo off because his name is Neo and not Mr. Anderson. Anyway, everybody should watch the movie. But in other words, Thor is finally becoming the kind of god that he is meant to be, maybe at the guiding hand of his father Odin, to force him to become something better than he currently is. In this case, not to save the world against robots, but to fight by his father's side at the final battle at Ragnarok, and potentially delaying it or finding a loophole around this fate to bypass what the Norns have written. And that's where we're going to leave it for now. Not necessarily victorious, not defeated. He's standing at the edge of what a god can do, even one with limits like the Norse gods have. In our next episode, we're going to jump right into the next chapter of Gylfaginning, which will be part 49, to discuss his brother's funeral, then the events of Lokasenna, then Loki's capture and torture. Then we're going to briefly discuss Ragnarok and its aftermath to truly wrap up his legacy. So thank you so much, everyone. I personally am 9 days away from being a father myself. Again, I'm not going to Odin for parental advice, so don't worry. But again, may the gods help us all, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you for listening to Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. If you enjoyed the show, please follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, and leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you, and have a great day.